Chapter 31, The Isle of the Blessed. Lie her down, Sir Knight. Gaius's voice was sharp, disturbed as he had been from his somnolence. Startled by the intrusion, he saw his apprentice carrying Elund, saw the translucentness of her skin, saw the blood. He had emerged from the shadow of Morgana's bedside, his eyes red from exhaustion. He swallowed, blinked, to restore his usual scholarly warmth. In the end it was Percival who had scooped up Elund from the feet of the prince and followed Merlin up the steps to Gaius's tower. Merlin threw the door open and Percival stood before the physician. Gaius. Merlin's voice soft, moving his hand from her leg. She's bleeding. It won't stop. As Gaius moved with the practiced, frantic efficiency of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty, urging Percival to lie her on the bed behind the curtain. The knight turned and nodded his head towards Elund, before striding to the door, his boots thudding down the stone steps. Saying nothing, Merlin locked the door behind them. The corridor outside erupted with a heavy thudding of boots. Merlin looked back, then over towards Elund. He pressed his back to the wood, not that his weight would do any more than the large iron bolts, but he felt he wanted to put him between the outside world and Elund, and he watched for a moment as Gaius gingerly encouraged his patient. Merlin, open this door. Arthur's voice, usually the embodiment of royal composure, was frayed, betraying his fear. Beside him, Gawain shouted Aeled's name. Merlin stood with his back against the timber, his hands trembling but his stance absolute. The insistent, impatient hammering came to the door as he stood beside it, but he did not yield to the prince's demands. He knew what Gaius was uncovering beneath the layers of leather and linen. He knew the nature of the loss that was even now draining the life from his friend. He had seen such before, when he was young, when a villager had left a girl washed up on the shore to be tended. She had a name then. Merlin dashed it away, as he felt more hammering on the door behind his back. Go away, sire. Merlin yelled, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tears tracking through the grime on his face. Gawain. Gaius is doing all he can. Let him. The banging stopped as quickly as it had begun and the silence echoed without and within the tower. Merlin looked across to Gaius, who had drawn the curtain around the bed on which Percival had laid her, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic splash of water in a ceramic basin and the low, urgent murmurs of the physician. 88,888,888 and it was now the summer. The Saxon raids had ceased, become dormant for now, and there had been no sign of Morgause or Sennead. Arthur had spent the time rebuilding and reinforcing Camelot, sending the knights out across the kingdom looking for talented youths who could be trained and may one day be knights themselves. Elund had recovered, and slipped back into the role of Morgana's guard, while Arthur slipped mentally further from the world. Arthur had been to see her, face merry and the smell of fermented animal fat and fireplace ash, the ingredients that was used for washing clothes, telling her she would take up her place as guard and that he was glad to see her well. Often she would ask herself if Morgana remembered that night and what she had said to Elund. It was something she held on to, that and Mordred's saving of her life. For what? If she had been so unwell, Gaius had saved her life, but no more. The bleeding had come to an end a month after her exertion. It could have happened at any time, and for any reason, Gaius had told her, offering her another bowl of unending chicken soup as Merlin spent his time not with Arthur beside her. And when Elund could stand and when she could hold her sword, she returned to training with the guards and again with the knights. Gawain was one of the last knights to approach her, and she took him to one side one warm summer night, not dissimilar to one where he had encouraged her with him to the secluded spot in the hayloft. I love you, he told her. I have loved you for a long time. Elund let him kiss her forehead, before telling him that she could never be with him again. If I wish to be a mother I cannot risk that again, she told him. She loved Gawain too, she told him. And he took her in his arms and they stayed together for the longest time. They would be friends for their lifetime, he told her. But the look he gave Elund when she left told her that their bond had gone. Arthur's decline grew worse, and Elund watched Arthur step into, and embody the role of king far more than his father had done. One day, however, when Arthur decided to go hunting, he came across a beast which attacked the king, licking his arm, and causing him paralysis. A questing beast, Gaius told Arthur, when he attended the king. His saliva is not a poison, rather than a paralysis of the soul. It is a creeping, metaphysical frost, sire. And Ear had turned Uther Pendragon into a marble effigy of himself. And what will save him? Arthur asked. When Gaius told him, Arthur neither deliberated nor hesitated. Leaving Sir Hector in charge of the castle, Arthur saddled his horse and made his way to the courtyard. "You think you are going alone?" asked Elund, who had descended from her now residence above the horses, when she was not guarding Morgana. She nodded to the other 4 horses saddled and ready to go. "They are in the armory." Aled, Arthur began, calling her by her warrior name. "You cannot come with me." "You cannot go alone," Elund countered. "I told you to stay in the physician's chambers," Arthur insisted, his voice harsh as he looked at Elund, whose face was still a ghostly pallor, her body held together by stubborn willpower. "This is not a quest for a woman who can barely stand." "Then it's a good thing I've never been particularly good at following the instructions of arrogant princes," Elund replied. "You think you're the only one allowed to throw your life away for a cause, Arthur? You think I'm going to sit here and polish your memorial while you go off to play martyr?" She took some steps towards him. "What happens when you do a prattish thing, and there's no one to get you out of it?" She took a step closer to the regent of Camelot. "Pardon my language," she added, mock deferentially, "I use only the term provided to me by your servant." Clotpole being another. Despite himself, Arthur tried to suppress the smirk that her words invoked. He nodded to the Saxon girl, her hands steady as she checked the tightness of her saddle. "You aren't coming," Arthur stated, his voice a gravelly ruin of exhaustion. "None of you are. This is not a matter of swords or shields, Elund. It is a transaction of a far more permanent nature." "A transaction," she echoed, her voice possessing a hollow, resonant quality. "You go to bargain with a power that views mercy as a linguistic error. You think to offer your life for a king who is already a spectre, whose passing would not only be accepted by your people, but, in some quarters, celebrated." She saw him smart at this, but it drove her on. "Camelot cannot survive on the memory of a prince. The land needs you, Arthur, alive, or the Saxons will invade." Arthur stepped into her space, the proximity between them vibrating with a tension that was part royal command and part something far more ancient. "Is that a threat?" "It's logic," she told him, refusing to rise to the accusation. "And if the price is a life, I will not have it be yours." "You are the daughter of Mercia, a bridge between peoples." "I am a mercenary who has no future but to serve the land in which she was found." "My mother's land," she interrupted, her gaze level and devastatingly cold. "I am expendable, Arthur. In the cold calculus of this world, I am the better currency. If a life must be laid upon the altar to preserve the future of this island, let it be the one that has already begun to fade." "And the knights?" "Morgana speaks in her sleep," Elund told Arthur. "She speaks of Morgause and of Senird." "The knights are needed here. Set Leon to the task, and we will be back far quicker, just the 2 of us." 88,888,888. The journey to the Isle of the Blessed was less than a day's ride away, and physically this was no match for either of them. However, mist clung to the land and the water surrounding the castle like a funeral cloth, but at least it dampened the sound of the oars as they rowed across the lake that acted like a moat to the mysterious castle. Blessed was not what Elund would call the castle. Damned was more like it. She watched the light of the sun on Arthur's form as it dappled across him in the breaks in the cloud. In this grey, liminal space, the prince's titles were gone from him, ebbing away, leaving only a man behind, driven by a desperate, beautiful will to succeed in a place embodied with magic. And it was there, amidst the silence of that great lake, that Elund allowed her mind to settle on the knowledge that she loved him, not with the frantic, earthly heat she felt for Gawain, but with a profound, structural devotion that transcended the physical. It was a love that demanded nothing but the right to exist. As they got closer to the isle, however, Elund quickly buried the feeling and turned to the practical that she had promised to the Prince of Camelot. 88,888,888. Had the isle been a person, it would have been one of mild manner, awakened from daydreams by the touch of a hand on the shoulder, and smiled at the intrusion. Unlike the person dwelt another spirit, and she was waiting within the skeletal remains of the ancient hall. Merlin knew who she was, had been a young boy when she had been brought to his parents' home for life-saving care. A fisherman had found her washed up with the tide, clothed in heavy cloth, thin and wraith-like beneath it. He had never forgotten the form, nor the silent acceptance of the treatment she had been given. Did he think Aeled and Arthur were going off together? He had sat beside Elune for months and her thoughts had become words, and they had been of quests and guarding and war. He could not, he would not, let them go alone. And yet there she was, Nimue, who had enchanted him at the feast for King Bayard of Mercia, who he had not recognized then, and had been the indirect cause of the trouble Camelot had seen since. He hid beside a stone pillar as he watched Elune and Arthur, swords raised, approach the enchantress, and watched her face as it twisted with terrible delight. "A life for a life," she whispered, the words curling through the air like smoke. "The balance must be restored. Who among you has come to pay the debt of the Pendragons?" Arthur stepped forward, his jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line. "Take mine, my father's life, for my own." "No." Elune moved with a sudden, fluid violence, interposing herself between the prince and the enchantress. Her hand was on her dagger, not to strike, but as a grounding weight. "He is the future of Camelot. Take me. I am the daughter of a king who disowned me, a sister to a knight who does not know I live. My life will not alter the path that Camelot is on." She stepped forward and then further once again. "Number." Arthur's word echoed her own, but there was a stillness in his voice, a calmness. His hand clamped onto her shoulder, turning her toward him. "I will not let you do this. I am the one who must pay a broken bar for those lives lost at my father's hand." "Why?" she hissed, her eyes blazing. "Because of duty? Because you think your death will somehow wash away your father's sins?" "Because," Arthur said, the word catching in his throat, and his words caught and were said silently to himself. And she saw the honor that she loved, the faithfulness to Gwen that she respected. Elune stepped back, her expression hardening into a mask of stoic acceptance as the magic began to coil around the altar like a gathering storm. And she raised her sword, as if metal could vanquish the energy of magic, Merlin thought, as the atmosphere within the citadel. And then he turned his head, they all did, at the sound. It began as a low humming, like a meadow invaded by pollinators on a hot, balmy day, bees roiling in the heat, enjoying the bounty. And then it grew, the air splitting apart, the clouds of the mist, the enemy of the hot, summer's day betraying the heat and the light, massive wings that filled the vista of the landscape, flapping them over the ruins of the castle, over the Isle of the Blessed. "A broken bar, the cup of life, a broken bar, its water will save Arthur, a broken bar." Merlin heard the Kilgor's words in his head as if the great dragon was screaming them to the earth. He looked at Arthur and Elune, as they crouched at the roar that enveloped the scene. Elune moved, out of the ruins, and into a clearing where she looked for him. Kilgore circled in the air, moving it around with his wings, and peered down at her. She extended a hand to the beast, and he bowed his head to her, allowing her to touch his nose. "I regret that the life you carried is gone from the world," Kilgore told her. Elune withdrew her hand slowly, and bowed her own head. No words, no tears. Two living beings sharing a moment of sorrow, before she looked back at Arthur. "A broken bar, go to the princeling if you must. A broken bar," Kilgore told her, "a broken bar for your fate, little say, and his are entwined." "A broken bar, no," Elune insisted in her own mind, guessing the dragon could hear. "No, I must leave Arthur, have no more involvement with his life." "A broken bar." The great dragon's roar ebbed into the stones as he reared back from Elune and flapped his great wings. On the altar, Nimue watched the exchange with eyes like cold stars. Her gaze shifted from Arthur to the warrior woman before him, but finally settled on the shadows of the pillars. There, Merlin stood, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nimue's eyes softened, if only for a fraction of a second, as she looked at the young warlock. She remembered a time before her exile, when a fisherman had found her broken and salt-drenched on a distant shore. She remembered the hearth of a small cottage and the kindness of a woman named Eunice and a man who held the secrets of dragons. They had saved her life when she was nothing but a wraith of heavy cloth and sea-water. "The balance," Nimue whispered, her voice a silken thread through the ruins, directed toward Merlin. "It is not a gift, young warlock, even for the son of those who once gave me mercy. It is a trade, a life for a life." Before Arthur could step forward to offer his own soul, Merlin moved. He had followed them in secret, driven by a dual terror, one for the prince he served, and another for Elund, the woman who had broken his chains and freed Kilgara. She was the keeper of his secrets, a sister in spirit who had seen his magic and stayed by his side. He knew she was dented by her recent loss and there was no chance that he would let her offer what little of herself that she had left. "Take mine," Merlin said, his voice cracking but certain. He stepped between them, his eyes meeting Elund's for a fleeting, silent second, a look of profound understanding. "My life for the kings. Let the debt of the Pendragons be settled with me." Nimue's smile was a wound, a cruel distortion of the gratitude she once owed his kin. She stepped forward, the air around her shimmering with the distorted heat of the cup of life. From the folds of her robes, she produced a vial, the water within glowing with a translucent, celestial light. "The water of the cup. It will mend the spirit and thaw the frost of the questing beast. Go, Merlin. Save your king." Arthur reached for Merlin, his brow furrowed in a mixture of anger and bewilderment, but Elund caught the prince's arm. Her hands were trembling, her strength finally flagging as the magical atmosphere of the isle pressed against her weakened frame. She knew Merlin's power and the magnitude of what he was doing, yet in her exhaustion, she could only watch as he took the vial. The betrayal, however, did not come in fire. It came in a sudden, sickening wrenching of the world. As they made their frantic return to Camelot, the balance did not claim Merlin immediately. Instead, the price skipped across the kingdom, seeking out the gentle heart of the woman who had once nursed Nimue back to health, Eunice. When the news reached Merlin, of the sudden, inexplicable wasting of his mother, the boy who had been a servant became something ancient and terrible. While Arthur administered the water to a recovering Uther, Merlin vanished. He returned to the isle alone, ignoring the cries of his friends. He went to offer himself again, to claw his mother back from the veil. But he found he was too late. Gaius, knowing the boy would never survive the guilt, had reached the isle first. The physician had bartered his remaining years for Eunice, standing before Nimue with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen enough of death to no longer fear its face. "You have taken everything." Merlin's scream tore through the citadel as he found Gaius's cooling body, and then he stood before the enchantress, summoning every ounce of strength and energy he possessed. "Come on then." "Come, Nimue. It is you, or it is me." 88,888,888. The duel that followed was not one of swords, but of the very elements. Nimue moved with the grace of the tide, her magic an explosive force that cast Merlin across the flagstones, a fireball blossoming against his chest. For a moment, the world went dark, and Nimue turned away, convinced the debt was settled in blood. But Merlin was the son of the earth and the sky. He rose, a spectre of soot and lightning, his eyes glowing with a gold that rivaled the sun. He did not merely strike, he commanded the heavens. A bolt of pure, white lightning descended, shattering the silence of the isle. In that final, desperate moment, Merlin reached into the thread of existence and wove a new ending. He traded Nimue's dark, enduring life for the spark of Gaius's, forcing the balance to right itself through the sheer gravity of his will. Gaius drew breath, the color returning to his face, while Nimue dissolved into the mist. As the dust settled, Merlin believed the cup of life had been shattered in the wake of the magic. He left the isle with Gaius, returning to a Camelot to find that Uther lived but as a hollow shell, and where Arthur and Elund stood on the battlements, bound by a shared secret and the heavy price of a king's life. He did not know then that the cup had endured, traded by the ancient people living on the land in the north of Cymru, with traders and with travelers, at last falling into the hands of druids in Senied's kingdom. a golden curse waiting for its next master. Mordred touched the cup as Senniad asked the druids to interpret its meaning, and felt its warmth, its history, and saw the face of his friend again. 888,888,888. The atmosphere in Camelot, following the return from the Isle of the Blessed, was not one of triumph, but of a strange void, a vacuum waiting for something to fill it. The king had been restored, the balance ostensibly righted, yet the air remained heavy, as if something was about to happen, of discontent, of unease. For Elund, the citadel had become a graveyard of memories, most of them she wished never to be reminded of again. A broken bar of the child she had lost, the suffocating weight of Gwain's unrequited devotion, and the unbearable, constant presence of Arthur, whose survival was a miracle that felt, to her, like a beautiful, serrated edge, making her happy for a moment, then filling her with miserable dread. She loved Arthur, a bitter, painful emotion that both kept her there and made her want to fight. She must leave now, leave them all behind. She could no longer stand to be there with all that had passed. She must be a mercenary again, or at least control her own fate. Mercia was east, the northern Cymric land of Vcht was north. The Irish lived across the western sea, and there was always Niceman should she wish to ally with the Druids, or even to Eryri to Kilgara. No, Elune thought. Don't go now. Go in the morning, when you are fresh, when you have slept. 88,888,888. The dawn was a pale, anemic thing when she led her mare toward the main gates. She had stripped away the livery of Camelot, returning to the worn, functional leathers of the mercenary who had first appeared in the forests of Mercia. You're leaving. The voice was familiar, arrogant even in its exhaustion. Arthur stood in the shadow of the archway, his cloak pulled tight against the morning chill. He looked less like a prince and more like a man who had stared into the depths of the earth and found it wanting. He had seen her the night before, seen her restless and disturbed. So he had mounted a one-man guard outside the stable until she emerged. The job is done, Arthur, Elune said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she adjusted the saddlebags. The king is awake. Morgana is safe. My contract with your house has reached its natural conclusion. Arthur stepped into the light, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, unspoken intensity. And what of the knights? What of the people who have come to rely on you? What of Gwain? He paused, the name tasting like ash. Are you leaving with him? Is that where this leads? Elune let out a short, dry laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Gwain is a good man, Arthur. Perhaps too good for the version of me that remains. No, I am not leaving with him. I am leaving alone. Then why? Arthur demanded, moving closer, his frustration beginning to simmer. You have a place here. I have offered you a title, a home, a broken bar. You offered me a cage with better scenery, she interrupted, her gaze finally meeting his. I cannot stay in a city where every stone reminds me of what I've lost, or what I can never have. I am going to find Lancelot. He is the only one who truly understands the weight of being an outsider in your father's world. Arthur flinched at the mention of his former friend, a flicker of jealousy and grief crossing his features. Lancelot is gone. He was banished. Then I shall find where he is, she said, mounting her horse with a fluid, practiced grace. He is my cousin, and he made a home in the far north, a place called Joyous. He has a wife and a son. Arthur reached out, his hand about to touch hers, before landing briefly on the horse's bridle, as if attempting to anchor her in Camelot, but failing. And if I asked you to stay, not as a guard, not as a mercenary, but as ... as what? What role do I have? Not as a guard and not as a mercenary, a broken bar. And she leaned in towards him for a moment, before stepping away, her hand brushing his as he loosed the bridle. Without a backward glance, she kicked the mare into a trot, leaving the prince standing alone in his own kingdom. 88,888,888. But the road did not offer the sanctuary she sought. As Elune reached the outskirts of the lower town, the very earth seemed to groan. The sky, which had briefly cleared, curdled into a bruised purple, and a raw, primal, ancient, and devastatingly familiar, shattered the morning silence. Elune knew exactly who was coming, and she turned to feel the air shatter with the thunder of scales. High above the turrets of Camelot, the great dragon Kilgore circled the citadel. Elune pulled her horse to a halt, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered the darkness of the caverns beneath the castle. She remembered the whispered promise she had made when she turned the key to his ancient shackles, believing that freedom was a universal right, even for monsters. She had released him. And now, he had come to collect the debt. The dragon's breath turned the horizon into a furnace, the flames licking the very walls she had just tried to escape. From the battlements, she saw the frantic scramble of guards and the glint of Arthur's armor as he rallied the men. The threat of Nimue had not ended at the isle, it had merely mutated. The enchantress had known that the balance required a cataclysm, and the dragon had been channeled by her for her own ends. Elune looked toward the forest, toward the path that would lead to Lancelot and a life away from the madness of the Pendragons. Then she looked back at the smoke rising from the Camelot. Then she saw Arthur, a small, silver figure standing against the fire, shouting orders, refusing to yield even as the world burned around him. "Damn you, Arthur Pendragon," she hissed, the words a mixture of curse and prayer. She wrenched the horse's head around. She could not leave. How could she? As the great dragon dived toward the castle, Elune drew her sword, her silhouette a lone shadow racing back toward the flames. If a life needed to be taken, it would be hers. 88,888,888 across the courtyard, Merlin watched Elune withdraw her sword. He had languished in the misery of the death of his father, and now his mother at the hand of the enchantress who was now controlling Kilgore. He could do something now. He could command the dragon. Elune had declared what he was now, what he had always been. Merlin, the great Emrys, was the last dragon lord. Only he could defeat Nimue's power against Camelot. Merlin stood between Elune and Kilgore, as he saw the great dragon open his massive jaws. "You shall not," he commanded. "You shall not." There was a moment, a small moment. Elune stood fast beside Merlin, whose arms were raised in the air. She expected flame, or to be plucked from the ground in the dragon's mighty mouth. A reptilian eye caught hers and, as if a veil had been pulled from his mind, Kilgore looked at his human friend. "A broken bar girl." "Human, a broken bar," Kilgore told Elune in her mind. "A broken bar, come with me, a broken bar, a broken bar. Am I not to stay? Is my fate not to be with Arthur, a broken bar?" Kilgore whipped his tail 50 feet behind him and rippled his body around the castle. Masonry fell. Citizens screamed. "A broken bar, you could come to safety with me, a broken bar, you area broken bar, my friend, a broken bar, a broken bar." And Arthur? Elune thought back to the dragon. What of him, a broken bar? A broken bar, you would come back to him, a broken bar, as his fate, a broken bar. And Elune made to take a step towards the dragon again, and go with him, his beguiling argument against her weakness and tiredness too attractive for her to want to fight. Then, she realized Merlin had heard everything they had said. He took a step in front of Elune again and raised his arms. "Go, leave this place. Leave this place." With a scream like the death throes of 1,000 horses, Kilgore, the great dragon, wheeled into the air as if shocked, as if in pain. He could no more resist Merlin's words as he could resist the call to eat or drink. His body rippled away into the sky as if swimming through the currents, his cry one of a thwarted being, mournful and protesting. Elune breathed, then turned slowly to look at Merlin. "There is a bed for you in Gaius's tower," the young man told her, returning to his usual, unobtrusive self. Elune said nothing, but looked up to Gaius's tower. After everything Merlin had done to save the physician, at such personal cost, she was amazed he was so calm. "I'm here for Arthur, nothing more," Elune told him, as she glanced up to the sky where Kilgore had been. "Nothing more," Merlin agreed, as the prince clambered down from the high tower, his usually neat appearance being undone for once. Both shin shields and his breastplate clattered onto the stone below, and he was holding his head. Elune looked where Merlin was looking. The words, disheveled and unkempt, came to mind. "And, I think," Merlin finished, "he will need all the help he can get."